Hello and welcome to another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Jamie Johnson, the legal correspondent, and we have a very special guest today. We have Representative Ron Kind. Ron, thanks for coming.
Jamie, glad to be here.
And today you happen to be in Hudson. What brings you to Hudson?
Well, we're having these small business forums throughout the congressional district, throughout Western Wisconsin, getting small business owners together with a lot of experts in running various agencies and programs set up to help small businesses, especially now. I mean, the small businesses are the backbone of our regional economy. They're going to be the locomotive to help pull us through this great recession that we're starting to come out of right now. Yet there are a lot of programs and services existing to help support small business to be successful, to expand their operations, to hire more people, or perhaps just start a small business and get them up on their feet. So we had a nice event at the Hudson Center, the UW River Falls right here in Hudson. Representatives of the Small Business Development Center, the SBA, Small Business Administration, the Department of Commerce, even the IRS was there talking about the tax incentives that exist today for small businesses, like a new healthcare tax credit that small businesses are qualifying for under the Affordable Care Act, accelerated depreciation, tax credits for startup costs for small businesses, and then export opportunities too. I mean, there are a lot of small businesses realizing there's a vast market across our borders and overseas for the exporting of goods and products and services that they're involved in. So we're trying to open up those doors as well.
Okay. Well, and like you said, small business employs a lot of people, and we need to get them back on track. Is some of this go to financing and the banks? I mean, the bank crisis is what got us into this recession in 2008, and so what's being done there?
Yeah, there's no question between the housing market and then the financial collapse that we experienced. It definitely had an effect on credit to businesses large and small, but especially acute for small businesses. And that is the number one issue they always raise with me when I'm visiting them, is the access to credit, the lines of credit, which is the bloodline to their existence. And so having a representative from the Small Business Administration that does the 7A and 504 loans, the guaranteed loans, and also the brick and mortar loans for building projects was helpful, because they work with our local lenders, the community bankers, credit unions. That's where the loans are funneled through to go to small businesses. And Wisconsin ranks #1 in the nation when it comes to SBA loans to small businesses. And we also rank at the top when it comes to a low default rate, which shows that
which I think is the more important.
It is. You know, we're not losing any money with this, and it's a crucial lifeline to these small businesses, to the credit, again, to our local lenders who participate in these programs, work very closely with the small businesses, and make sure that they're helpful.
Well, the focus in Washington and across the nation has been on, and the current topic being the federal debt and deficits.
Right.
We've seen deficits balloon. It's been a bad decade for the national debt. Starting in 2001, it was like 54% of GDP, and now for 2010, it's to 93%. And those are the types of levels we saw after World War II and some of the other deep recessions, although this was the deepest recession we've had. So where do you stand when it comes to the federal budget plans? We've seen Paul Ryan's come out. President Obama has his.
Yeah.
And there's been some interesting things in the New York Times website I'll bring up, but basically, where do you see this getting solved?
Well, Jamie, I have my own deficit reduction plan on my website. If people want to know where I've been focusing my efforts in order to reduce federal spending, they can go to my website. And I come from the Willie Sutton School of Budgeting. Willie Sutton's that famous bank robber, and they asked him, why do you rob banks? He said, that's where the money is. Well, we got to go to where the big spending categories are in the federal budget if we're going to be honest about these structural long-term deficits that we're facing that are clearly unsustainable. And the largest and fastest growing area of spending at all levels, federal, state, and local, and for most businesses and families alike, rising healthcare costs. So any discussion that doesn't address the need to curtail and put a lid on the rising healthcare costs isn't really being honest. But I think there are two different approaches here. One is what I've been advocating, and that is through the Affordable Care Act, changing the way healthcare is delivered in this country, but most importantly, how we pay for it. So it's based on the value or the outcome of care that's given, and no longer on the volume of care. That's what's bankrupting us right now. And that's exactly what our healthcare providers in this region have been calling for, is a outcome-based reimbursement system, so we get a better bang for the buck, but without jeopardizing the access and quality of care at the same time. Now, my friend and colleague Paul Ryan from Wisconsin introduced his own budget about a week ago that calls for privatizing the Medicare program, ending Medicare as we know it today, and instead giving seniors a voucher which will be inadequate in dealing with the costs that they'll experience in the private health insurance market. And in fact, early analysis shows that it would double the out-of-pocket expenses of seniors. But the fundamental flaw with that strategy, I think, is the simple fact. Medicare was created back in 1965 because private health insurance companies do not want to insure seniors. They're not profitable. As we get older, we consume more health care. It's harder to spread the risk with that demographic group. And yet, privatizing Medicare, giving seniors a voucher and saying, now go out and shop for your own private insurance plan, I think is a recipe for disaster and will only lead to more expense out of seniors' pockets when they can ill afford it. And so that's a very different approach, what's being advocated from where I'd like to see us go. Reining in healthcare costs, also addressing the second largest spending category, which is defense funding. And anyone who doesn't think we can find greater efficiencies and cost savings in a defense budget isn't being honest. I mean, the Pentagon today keeps telling Congress, stop appropriating money for certain weapon systems that they no longer need and they no longer require.
Now, does that happen because of congressmen protecting turf, whether it's congressmen or senators, and it comes down to these earmarks?
Well, I think it happens for a couple of reasons. One, defense contractors are smart and they know how to spread the subcontracts around so it touches virtually every congressional district. So no longer is it about spending money for weapon systems we no longer need. It's about jobs back home, and that makes it difficult to reform. But also I think there's some philosophical differences. There are members of Congress who think we need that 11th aircraft carrier when no other country in the world has one aircraft carrier. And so it really depends on your vision of what an effective defense system should look like for our country today. But even the weapon systems that we're currently acquiring, that are being procured today, they're $300 billion over budget. So this blank check that defense contractors expect from the American taxpayers got to end, or we're going to bankrupt ourselves. And then the other big spending category I've been focused on is Farm Bill reform. It makes no sense that we have huge taxpayer subsidies going to a few but very large agribusinesses in this country, most of whom have mailing addresses in Manhattan, Chicago, San Francisco. These aren't even family farmers working the land, and yet we're spending so much money every year on these outdated commodity subsidy programs, which is not fiscally responsible to the American taxpayer, nor does it help family farmers who need it in places like Wisconsin.
Well, I was just going to ask you that because of the heavy reliance on agriculture in the 3rd Congressional District. Don't you risk some political fallout from advocating reducing the subsidies to farms?
You know, I do, because we are such a large agriculture producing state that our state would have to take a haircut too. But most of the farmers know how the system's been rigged and who's really deriving the benefit of these huge taxpayer subsidies. And it is the big boys in the agricultural industry and not your family farmers. There are ways that we can structure programs that do directly benefit family farm operations, most of which we see around our state of Wisconsin, but without wasting so much tax dollars at the same time, nor distorting the marketplace, because farmers too often are planning for the government paycheck as opposed to market conditions. And we're also seeing in this area too a lot of sensitive land being brought back into production because of the high cost of these commodities that are being produced. That's going to have an effect on quality water supplies, habitat protection, wildlife protection, another important stable of Wisconsin's economy.
Absolutely. Now, when it comes to solving the deficit, and actually there's a website, the New York Times has a blog, and they call it Economix, E-C-O-N-O-M-I-X. And people can look it up, and they've got different articles. They've shown a recent poll showing America's dissatisfaction with the way Washington's handling our deficit. President Obama has a 59% disapproval rating when it comes to handling the federal budget deficit, but Congress is at 63%. And when it comes,
I'm surprised it's that good.
well, but when it comes down to is it's pretty much common sense, isn't it? And there's an article just today by an economics professor at Harvard, Edward Glazer. Now, I don't know, do you know Professor Glazer?
Not personally, but I've heard of him and read some of his work.
All right. And didn't you study economics at Harvard?
I did. I was there.
And, well, his article is entitled A Time for Radical Centrists. And it says that while it's easy to whip up either the extreme, but what we've had is Congress protecting those special interests on either end, and we've ended up with these increasing deficits. How is the center going to get any kind of traction with the partisanship that's going on in Congress?
Listen, I've always viewed myself as a moderate centrist representative of western Wisconsin, because I think it's in the sensible center where the common ground can be found. And I know there's a lot of common ground throughout this country. You wouldn't believe it listening to the political rhetoric, and you're right, it seems so far right or so far left that people are wondering what happened to the vast middle of America today. I think it's still there, and it just requires some reasonable minds to get together and talk and listen to each other. And when you do that, you start developing trust, which is an important component to reaching agreement. But you also have to have the attitude, which I think is lacking today, that it's got to be an element of give and take, that your idea, it's not going to be your way or no way at all. And that's a fundamental element of any democracy to survive. And more members I've noticed getting elected to office are coming with it's their way or no way approach to doing business, which is a recipe for stalemate and more partisanship and gridlock and nothing getting done.
And we always saw that with this last election. A lot of freshmen, mostly Republicans, but the Tea Party having a very strong movement, and they want to focus on one area, and that's cutting spending. But when it comes to solving the budget deficit and that deficit puzzle, if you will, it's pretty obvious it's got to be a combination of tax cuts and spending. Whether that's going to be 2 to 1, one way or the other, it's got to be a combination. Is that
Well, I think you're right. I think there has to be. I mean, listen, the wealthiest 2% today, they're not paying a 35% tax rate. Their effective rate, what they're actually paying, is 17%, which is lower than what most working families are paying. And that's because of the tax code, and it's full of deductions and tax breaks that only the wealthy can take advantage of. And so part of, I think, fixing the deficit and our long-term fiscal health challenge that we face is comprehensive tax reform and introducing fairness back in the tax code. And listening to people like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett who are saying it is wrong that they're paying a lower effective tax rate than the receptionist is in their own firms.
How do you get movement, though? Because I agree with you that everyone's going to have to sacrifice here. You mentioned the 3 areas: farm subsidies, defense, and Medicare. But it's going to come to a lot of things to solve, because these deficits go out into the future, they get bigger, they don't get smaller, and it start reining in that spending, there's going to have to be sacrifices across the board.
Right.
But it's like, no, you go first. Is it going to have to be, because we have a debt ceiling that's going to have to be raised. Otherwise, government's going to shut down. We just avoided one government shutdown, what, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, by coming together with an agreement. And this was a fight over whether we're going to cut $39 billion from the current budget or whether it's going to be $33 billion, and which is still less than 1% of what the deficit needs to be cut. But what?
Well, I think first of all,
what's going to happen
and
first?
foremost, we have to recognize what the greatest contributor of the budget deficits we're facing today is, and what's most important to dealing with deficits in the future, and that's economic growth. I mean, the reasons why the deficits have exploded in the last couple of years is because of the Great Recession, and revenues have just dropped off the cliff. And that's the biggest cause of these large deficits that we face. So any plan to get our fiscal house in order also has to be focused on getting the economy back on track, creating good paying jobs, which will naturally lead to higher revenue coming from a growing, expanding economy. It's what happened during the 1990s. That, coupled with some budget enforcement rules that we enacted called pay-as-you-go. So you couldn't recommend a tax cut or a spending increase without offsetting it and paying for it. But we also had a very dynamic economy where 22 million private sector jobs were created, and it resulted in 4 years of budget surpluses. We were paying down the national debt, which was a very healthy economic dynamic to have at the time. But unfortunately, some saw that surplus and said, you know, we can't have this because we might pay off our debt too fast. And that's what led to the 2 big tax cuts that were enacted, to the passage of a new prescription drug plan. Not a nickel of it was paid for. 2 wars going on overseas, nothing paid for. The first time in our nation's history when actually taxes were cut during a time of war. And it's very little wonder that we had exploding budget deficits coming from that. And that's why I think part of this budget plan that we have to have is also investing in an innovation strategy for our nation so we can remain the most innovative, creative, and competitive nation in the world, creating industries and good paying jobs here at home. A national manufacturing strategy. A country as great as ours has to have the ability to produce and to build and to grow things as a nation. And there are things we can do to support domestic manufacturing right here in Wisconsin and throughout the country. And those are two key elements to getting this economy back on track so we can compete globally and our children have a better future to look forward to.
Well, you're mentioning some things that have been talked about for several election cycles, but nothing seems to get done. One that you mentioned was being in favor of the pay-as-you-go. And that's Professor Glazer in his article entitled A Time for Radical Centrists, which can be found on the NewYorkTimes.com website, talks just about that Congress needs to embrace the principle that spending and regulations need to pass through a cost-benefit analysis before it gets enacted.
Yeah.
Whatever happened to that?
I don't know. You know, oftentimes it's viewed through the eye of the beholder, and a lot of this is philosophically driven. I mean, give you an example, one cost benefit that we should be doing, whether it makes sense today that we're still giving $50 billion worth of tax breaks and subsidies to big oil companies when they're sitting on record profits, when oil per barrel now is about 110 bucks. In fact, a retired CEO of Shell Company a few weeks ago admitted during an interview that if oil goes above $70 a barrel, there should be no tax breaks or tax incentives based on what they're doing, because they're making money hand over fist at that point. Now we're approaching $110 a barrel. That's $50 billion in savings every year that we can realize just by reforming those subsidies going to big oil companies. But you know, one person's deficit reduction measure is going to be another person's industry that they're fighting to protect in Washington. And let's face it, you know, big oil is one of the more connected and powerful special interests that exists in our country today. So trying to take that away is a pretty big battle.
Okay. Well, he concludes, Professor Glazer concludes that there's no time for liberal or conservative extremism. We need some radical centrists ready to fight for fiscal responsibility and more cost-effective public spending. And it's about a 3-page article that just goes through and mentions some of the same things that you did. Also, that there's a deficit puzzle, if you Google that New York Times, and allows people to go through and these projected deficits, I think it was for 2017 or 2030. And the impact by making some slight adjustments, and you mentioned you know, some of these big spending issues are Medicare, defense spending, and trying to eliminate those excess spending, that it can have big impact. Now, it could be simple for the average taxpayer to use common sense, go on there 5 minutes. Why can't Congress take that puzzle and reach some kind of consensus, or at least get a plurality of people that reach across the aisle? And
Jamie, I did some a few weeks ago. I set up these deficit reduction forums, basically town hall meetings in the congressional district in La Crosse, Eau Claire, invited in representatives of the Concord Coalition. And they offer on their own website a deficit reduction kind of plan or exercise that people can go to and walk through the choices that we face as a nation today. They're also collecting a lot of the data from people who do participate, either online or at these forums, of what choices they're making. And certainly not to the surprise of me. Where most people are coming down is there's going to have to be some adjustment on the revenue side of the equation, especially when you got the wealthiest 2% only paying a 17% effective rate.
And big tax loopholes that need to be closed.
And big tax loopholes, a tax code that's in desperate need of reform and simplification, which can go a long ways. But also on the spending side too. And so it's going to require a combination. And that's exactly where these bipartisan fiscal commissions were coming down.
Right.
More on spending reduction than revenue increases, which I agree with. But now there's this so-called gang of 6, of 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats in the Senate working together to try to find the sweet spot when it comes to revenue increases and spending reductions. So there might be a bipartisan plan for people to rally around. But it's also going to require, you know, both parties to have to take a look at some of their sacred cows. On the Republican side, it's saying no to any type of revenue increase, no matter where it comes from or for whatever reason. And on the Democratic side, some of the entitlement programs too, that I feel is in desperate need of reform. And not least of which, and the biggest one again, is Medicare and Medicaid, because it's the health care costs that are really driving the huge deficits that we're facing today.
What about Social Security? You didn't mention Social Security, and when that system was established, it was set at an age that people figured they'd live 2 more years. The life expectancy was 67, so they set it at 65, and you could possibly start getting benefits.
FDR was genius in setting up that program back then, huh?
And life expectancies have gone up 15 years, but we haven't raised, only slightly in 1986 under Reagan and Tip O'Neill. They did raise it. I think Senator Proxmire was still in office then. But then nothing's been done about it since, and life expectancies continue to go up. Do you see a change in that? And I know that it meets with a lot of senior citizen opposition, but it doesn't have to if it's not going to apply to them. If it apply to folks like me that are 50 and under.
Yeah. Well, you know, right now in Western Wisconsin, the district that I represent, close to 70% of the seniors rely on Social Security as their primary source of income in their retirement years. That's a lot that rely on Social Security as their primary retirement vehicle. And but adjustments do have to be made over the next 75 years to maintain its solvency during that period. And it's kind of like peace in the Middle East. Everyone knows what needs to be done. It's how do you find the political path in order to get there? I mean, is it unreasonable to increase the retirement age by 1 year over the next 75 years? I don't think so. Should we be means testing Social Security so that the Herb Kohls or the Bill Gates of the world aren't receiving FICA taxes for some person working at Shopko or Target? I think
or eliminate the $106,000 cap.
Or the cap on the FICA, right, which is at $106,000. That's indexed, but for every dollar earned above $106,000, there's no longer any revenue raised from that. And that might be another area where there could be some bipartisan agreement. So the fixes are there. I mean, it's just a question of how we get to the political point where we can join arms and jump in.
Do we need urgency? I mean, you look at the NFL with their labor dispute and the judge's ruling recently about the lockout being taken out, and seen as a huge win for the players because there's no urgency now, because things can go on and they can, the old collective bargaining agreement basically stays in effect until you get a new one in. Now, with regard to Congress, we got this debt ceiling, and so it's going to have to be raised. What's the deadline we have now for that?
You're talking about the middle of May, the end of May, thereabouts.
Okay, but are we likely to see a huge tax code overhaul and these massive changes to entitlement programs in the 3 weeks that we have before that?
No, it's unlikely, but hopefully we can continue developing the roadmap of how we can get to a long-term deficit reduction plan. And I think there will be an attempt to try to tie into the debt ceiling increase to something like that, not expecting all the answers to be had already in May, which just won't happen. But I think it is going to be important that the debt ceiling is increased because the United States of America has to pay our bills, and that's what we're talking about here. And if we don't, and if we take it to the 11th hour, like we did with the government's budget this year, all it takes is for one big bond holder just to decide, geez, I'm not going to get caught holding these things which could prove worthless, and start dumping it. And that would create a whole new financial crisis that will make the one that we're just coming through look like a picnic, a walk in the park. And that would be disastrous if the U.S. defaulted on its obligations right now. So the clock is ticking. But to your original point too, we don't have time as a luxury when it comes to a lot of these reforms, such as Social Security. We've got a baby boom generation that will begin their massive retirement. So the sooner we can find some solutions, the easier and less painful it will be. And that's true for Medicare, it'll be true for Social Security. But we've got to start. And otherwise, these decisions will be much more harder politically, but also more painful to the average person.
And I want to finish, I know we're a little over our time, but I really appreciate you coming here. And I was wondering, you mentioned the Gang of Six on the Senate side. Is there a Gang of Six or even 4 or 12, some number that you could see yourself joining, that where there's some moderate Republicans on the other side that you guys could come to some agreement on these issues?
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of that, Jamie, reaching out to some moderate Republicans who are close friends of mine too, to see if we can establish the centrist caucus in the House of Representatives, which I think is desperately needed because most of the voices people are hearing are either on the far right or the far left of the political spectrum. And I don't think that's where the vast majority of the American people are. And working hard to develop those relationships, I think, is going to be key to moving forward. Because the truth is, if we're going to have a longer-term deficit reduction plan, it's going to have to be bipartisan at the end of the day. One party acting alone won't be able to do it. Now, there are different viewpoints on what the right course of action will be, but hopefully there are certain areas that we can reach agreement on, such as getting rid of a few of these outdated weapons systems that even our military leaders are advising Congress to stop spending money on. We're forming a healthcare system, so we're getting better value for the buck that we're spending, better outcomes with healthcare treatment. Models of care that we have in our own backyard here have proven very effective. So there are some certain spending categories that I've teamed up with colleagues on the other side of the aisle on that I think we can reach agreement on as well. But you know, as Churchill would say, he was always confident the United States of America will find the right answers with all these challenges that we face, but only after we exhaust all of our options first,
right.
which is kind of what we have in the political system today.
Exactly. Well, Ron, thanks a lot for coming on the show, and we hope that you will come back again, and after we have the deficit solved, we'll look for what the next problem is.
Be happy to.
All right, great, thank you. And thank you for joining us for another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal.